We've got players rising, players falling, players on bye weeks on this list, but one thing is for certain, our running backs are producing massive points in fantasy football. So make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support, because we're going through the top 30 running back rankings for week 5. Starting out with our first tier right here, we've got Derrick Henry and Alvin Kamara at 1 and 2. Derrick Henry goes to Cincinnati, takes on the Bengals this week. Obviously, what Derrick Henry was doing right now, it's just such a cherry on top of an already Hall of Fame career. Like, this dude is going to Baltimore. He's 30 years old now, and he's still ripping off like 90-yard runs. Like, that's still what dude can do at that size. Derrick Henry was built for this. And honestly, this particular matchup here, not only did the Bengals get run all over last week by Chuba Hubbard, their defense stinks, and this has one of the highest over-unders of the week. I actually think this is going to be a massive week for both teams of fantasy football that you want options in, and I think Henry continues to build on the momentum. And then Kamara here at Kansas City on Monday night, this one's going to be tough it's going to be a tough follow, honestly, because Alvin Kamara is, I can't imagine he doesn't come in questionable at the very least. I read the dude played through some broken ribs on Sunday. I mean, that's not something that just like goes away all of a sudden, right? So I would have a hard time believing that on a Monday night game, Kamara is not questionable, so you need to have a backup plan because obviously Kamara's upside is sky high. And then James Cook at number 3 and Jordan Mason at number 4, still inside tier 1. We've got a good collection of high upside guys in this tier, and I think James Cook has a big rebound this week. The Houston Texans defense, they were a big disappointment last week. Trust me, ask a lot of people who watch my fantasy defense rankings. James Cook was also a big disappointment last week. I mean, really, it was the whole Buffalo Bills team that got steamrolled by an angry Baltimore Ravens team. Listen, the Texans are going to come in angry too, but I just think that James Cook is too elite in fantasy football to really consistently rank outside the top 5 at this point. I think him and the Bills have a bounce back game against the Houston Texans again in a very high over-under game. And then Jordan Mason at number 4. I mean, this dude has been fantastic. This guy has the most carries in the entire league right now. He's averaging basically 5 yards a carry. Jordan Mason should not go anywhere near your bench at this point, especially against an Arizona defense that just got ripped apart by the Washington Commanders. Now, I will say it is a divisional matchup. Those are always a little bit more tougher to tell, but Jordan Mason should not be on your bench. He is still a top 5 running back at this point. And then Kenneth Walker to round out the tier here at 5. Kenneth Walker versus the Giants. I mean, obviously the match was fantastic, but let's just take a second to appreciate the fact that he came out of a 2-week absence and had a hat trick against the Lions defense, man. The Lions run defense up to that point was really good. Now, the Lions defense is obviously not the toughest defense overall, but they're definitely better than the Giants defense. And honestly, I think if the Giants don't have Malik Neighbors in this game, their defense is going to be on the field forever because the Giants won't be able to get anything moving offensively. So I think that Kenneth Walker honestly has another chance to have another explosive game in this matchup versus the Giants. Now, dropping down to our next tier right here, we've got Breece Hall at 6, Kyren Williams at 7, and Aaron Jones at 8. I am on board with Breece Hall. I'm backing him up just like Aaron Rodgers did, and just like Robert Saleh did, and just like the entire Jets team is doing with Breece Hall right now. He will rebound. Do not forget what he was doing before week 4. He was averaging 17.7 fantasy points per game before the worst game of his career as an NFL player. And I remember last year, there was actually a bad game that he had, and Jets fans were calling him to be benched in that game. He responded very well. Why? Because the dude has heart, man. He's not going to just roll over because he has no pride. He does have pride. So I think the Jets calling for his head again, this is not a matchup that's great, but just remember after this one, Breece Hall is matchup proof, and whether the Vikings beat them or not, I expect the Vikings to win. I expect Breece Hall to have a good rebound game. I'm planting my flag on him this week. Kyren Williams at 7 here, taking on the Packers. Matchup isn't great. I think the Vikings did what they did last week because the Vikings are a legit team. I think the Rams are not particularly great, but the one thing about Kyren Williams, he just continues to produce, even though their offense is hot garbage outside of him. So Kyren Williams just finds a way to get in the end zone every week. It seems like at this point, it's like he's almost better being the one and only guy on this offense than it is with having Cooper Kupp and Puka taking pressure off of him. So Kyron Williams, I think, at this point, can't be outside the top 10 because of his importance to the offense, and what he's able to do by himself is really excellent. And then Aaron Jones at 8 versus the New York Jets here. I think Aaron Jones is going to be just fine for the next several weeks. Like, the one thing that worries me with Aaron Jones is that, his injury history is not great, and it's an offense that's very similar to Green Bay's, so it's like, he's the number one, but there still is that Ty Chandler element in certain weeks. And this is not a particularly strong matchup, but again, I just think the Vikings are just rolling, and they're just rolling over people right now. So I don't really worry about a matchup when it comes to Aaron Jones or any of the Vikings players, to be honest with you. I expect Aaron Jones to have another strong week here. Now, dropping out to our next tier right here, we've got Brian Robinson Jr. at number 9 and James Conner at number 10. With Brian Robinson, listen, I'm actually really happy about this one, obviously, because if you were watching my channel before the start of the season, you know I was a big Brian Robinson truther. I was telling people this is going to be a breakout running back this year. I bought into the offense, and it's paying off early. They're taking on the Browns this week, who ordinarily over the last several years sounds like a tough matchup. The reality is they're getting hammered on defense. They've got injuries. It just doesn't look like a very good team. So at this point, the way that Washington is running their offense, I don't see how they're going to get stopped this week against the Browns. I think it'll happen at some point, but not against the Browns here. So Brian Robinson Jr., I think, has another really strong week with or without Austin Eckler, to be honest with you. And then James Conner at 10. James Conner here against the San Francisco 49ers. The matchup is not very good, but the reality is that, they got crushed last week against the Commanders, and James Conner had another really nice week. He had 18, 17 fantasy points, depending on your format. So James Conner, I just think, is ultimately just such a great player, and ultimately is just so efficient in this offense that he's going to continue to put up good weeks, whether or not they win the ball game. He's going to monopolize the backfield, so I don't worry about that one bit. And I think as long as James Conner just gets opportunities, he's going to be great in fantasy football. So I'm not particularly worried about him this week, even in a tougher matchup. Josh Jacobs at 11. I think that his story is coming. We're going to find out a lot about Josh Jacobs' long season in this game. At the Los Angeles Rams, the matchup should be excellent. He's had a couple different excellent matchups. I would argue a couple weeks ago when he had 30 carries, that was a great Josh Jacobs week. He fumbled in that game and didn't get in the end zone. That's what separated mid-fantasy production from great fantasy production, which he did not reach that week. This week, if he doesn't hit great fantasy production, we've got to have a really honest reassessment of what Josh Jacobs is going to be. I'm taking my last stand here with Josh Jacobs this week in Week 5 against the Los Angeles Rams in Los Angeles. And then rounding out the tier, Bijan Robinson and Joe Mixon here. Bijan Robinson and Joe, they're both going to be questionable heading into their games. Bijan Robinson's obviously playing on Thursday night. He's coming in with an injury, and it's really funny. Bijan's not been very good this year. He's done okay. You can't look at what he's done and say he's terrible in fantasy football, but obviously the price that you paid for him it's not paying off. So Bijan's under a lot of fire. I actually read an article before I started filming. Somebody said it's time for the Falcons to start considering benching him. I'm not there yet. Personally, I think he'll be fine. And against the Bucs this week, the defense is not particularly strong. I think it could be a bounce back week, but until we see better performances from Bijan, I have a hard time ranking him inside of the top 12 at this point. And then Joe Mixon here. Obviously, he'll be questionable. We'll have to see how his practice week goes. Nothing new on it yet, but what I did read from D'Amico Ryans is that this week he'll be considered day-to-day along with Tank Dell. So that should be a positive sign that he probably could return this week, especially since he was limited in Friday's practice of last week. So versus the Buffalo Bills this week, the matchup here ordinarily is not a fantastic matchup. Houston's offense is great though, and Joe Mixon has been really good for the Texans this year. So in one of the highest over-unders of the week, I expect Joe Mixon to be able to get the ball going for that offense on the ground because no other running back can do it. All we needed is to see him go out there and play, and he has a legit possibility, I think, this week. I'll tell you something else that's a legit possibility. Kirk Cousins hitting more than 0.5 total yards. That's his line on underdog right now. So obviously, not only is that a possibility, it's going to happen here. So if you haven't taken advantage of underdog yet and you're not on underdog, use the link in the comments below. And when you use code FFN to sign up for underdog and deposit at least $10, they'll match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 of bonus cash, and you'll be able to take advantage of that free Kirk Cousins line. Now, jumping out to our next tier right here, I've got Ramondre Stevenson at 14 and Travis Etienne at 15. Ramondre Stevenson versus the Miami Dolphins. Listen, I've told a lot of people this week, don't trade for Ramondre Stevenson. I don't think he's a particularly good buy low. On my buy low video, people ask me, where's Ramondre? I think he's a good buy low. I disagree with that. I don't think that he's a good buy low because I think their offense ultimately sucks and he's just going to have bad quality opportunities. But the reality this week is if the Miami Dolphins look anything like they have the past 2 weeks, Ramondre actually could have a good week. I actually think this is a really good week to sell Ramondre Stevenson if he does really well in this game. Because he'll fool a lot of people because he's getting the volume already. And number two, I think this week can be a really good week to pair with earlier weeks in the season and say, look, Ramondre Stevenson's actually a good fantasy back still, just a couple bad game stretches here. I think he's going to end up doing worse, so I actually think it's a good sell high opportunity rather than a buy low opportunity before this week. Because Ramondre, I think, could have a good week against the the Dolphins just stink. They're a dumpster fire. So are the Patriots, but the Dolphins look like a dejected team. So I think Ramondre actually has a pretty good week this week. And then with Travis Etienne versus the Indianapolis Colts, the Jags are straight up dejected. They look horrible. And I saw Doug Peterson made comments after that week 4 loss, and he said, look, we can't, as coaches, go out there and execute. So I don't think that's going to motivate his players to go out there and play harder. But I will say that Travis Etienne, the matchup actually should be pretty good against the Colts defense. So in a week where there's running backs that are really good that are on bye weeks this week, I gotta have Travis Etienne just pushed up a little bit higher than I'm usually comfortable with having him at. And then Chuba Hubbard's at 16. Chuba Hubbard, honestly, I want to rank him over Ramondre and Etienne. I want to rank him in that Bijan Robinson, Joe Mixon area because the reality is Chuba Hubbard, he's a top 13 back this year. He's done fantastic. This guy's averaging more than 5 yards per carry, and he's looked one of the best and most consistent options, along with Deontay in that Carolina offense here. I was big on him before the season. Those of you who were watching me in the offseason, you knew how crazy I was about Chuba Hubbard. I don't think this is a great week. The Bears defense is a wake-up call. Last week he played the Bengals. The week before that he played the Raiders. That's kind of two soft defenses that he had to go up against. The Bears defense is a different story. So as much as I want to rank Chuba higher, the matchup prevents me from doing so. And then rounding out the tier, Kareem Hunt at 17 and Devon Achane at 18. Kareem Hunt looks like he's already claimed the backfield. And honestly, it's not that hard. Carson Steele, when you're an undrafted free agent, and your family didn't even expect you to make the team because they planned you in a wedding in week 3 of the NFL season. They didn't even think you'd make the team. And then you come out and you fumble in 2 big games, in your 2 big opportunities. Yeah, your job's already taken. Kareem Hunt knows the system at least, and he is obviously familiar with the Chiefs. So he actually looked okay on Sunday. I don't think he's a super high upside player anymore, but I will say that I think he's kind of got a pretty good stranglehold on this backfield. So against the tougher New Orleans defense, he's not going to be that highly ranked. But again, he's got the grip on this backfield, and the Chiefs offense will find ways to get it done. So I wouldn't rule out Kareem Hunt getting in the end zone this week. Achane here at 18, man, it stinks. The Dolphins offense, the Dolphins team, as I said earlier, is a disaster. They look totally like they don't even care. It's like they have no pride. So at the New England Patriots, the matchup shouldn't be bad. I didn't think it was bad last week, though. Devon Achane just can't get anything going, though, because their passing game can't get anything going. It's a disaster. So Achane, the upside is still there. It's sort of like Tyreek, where it's he can go off any week at this point. But at this point, it's really hard to rank him much higher than this. Dropping down to our next tier right here, we've got Zach Moss at 19 versus the Baltimore Ravens, and Chase Brown at 20 versus the Baltimore Ravens. Obviously, these two guys split literally everything last week. They split duties last week to a T. And Chase Brown was the better player. It's very similar to what it was with Bucky Irving for the past several weeks, where they've been splitting duties and Bucky Irving's been the better player. Well, Chase Brown was the much better player between him and Zach Moss. I don't know if they're ready to move on from Zach Moss yet. I don't think they are. Zach Moss was still involved. He got in the end zone. Like, he did work for them the past several weeks. But Chase Brown just came out like a rocket ship. Like, if you actually watch two of these guys run, it's not even close who the more explosive back is. Chase Brown has Zach Moss by like a mile. I mean, this dude looks so much more explosive than Zach Moss. So again, against the Baltimore Ravens defense, that matchup sounds tough, obviously because of the James Cook stifling that they did just a couple days ago. But honestly, I think this matchup is going to be really high scoring. The Bengals, like historically with Joe Burrow, have done pretty well against the Ravens, and it's got a really high over-under for a reason with Vegas. They're expecting a lot of points. I am expecting a lot of points. So I think that both these guys have legitimate upside in this matchup. And then Bucky Irving at 21. Bucky Irving, I prefer him over Rachaad White. We're there. I can confidently say it at this point because Bucky Irving did the exact same thing as Rachaad White. As I was just saying with Zach Moss and Chase Brown, Bucky Irving and Rachaad White had identical running weeks, and Bucky Irving he had more opportunities through the air. So with Bucky Irving here, he looks like he might be taking over as soon as this week. Now, that's not to say that he's taken 100% of these running back opportunities. That's not to say he's taken 85%, but I think we could see a week where he gets 75 or 70%, and Rachaad White gets 25 or 30%. That's where we're at here because there's a clear answer who the better guy is, and it's Bucky Irving. So at the Atlanta Falcons here on Thursday night, I'm actually really interested in watching just how this particular matchup goes for both those running backs because I'm putting my money on Bucky Irving this week. And then to round out this tier, Austin Eckler at 22 and Jerome Ford at 23. So Austin Eckler obviously got the concussion in week 3, didn't play last week, but from what I've read, he's looking like he's on track to play. And so we'll have to monitor that practice situation. But the Browns matchup, again, what I said with Brian Robinson, it's not a bad matchup. And really, like, I said Austin Eckler was going to be relevant in fantasy this year earlier in the offseason. Obviously, I was really wrong about that. This offense has plenty to go around, especially at the running back position. Brian Robinson can have a good week, and so can Eckler, because Eckler's getting a lot of designed carries and designed targets his way. So with Austin Eckler, as long as he plays, the offense is just humming right now in Washington that I want a piece of everybody. And if Austin Eckler is available, and I've got to look a decision down between him and someone like Najee Harris, I'm taking Austin Eckler. And then Jerome Ford to round it out at 23 in this tier. At the Washington Commanders this week, Jerome Ford, I mean, the story's the same, right? Like, he's not handling a bunch of work, and unless he's getting in the end zone, like, he's just not that great. The matchup is pretty good. Obviously, against the Washington Commanders, they're letting everybody run all over them. I'm not worried about the matchup here. I just don't really think he's just not that great, and they don't count on him to handle 20 opportunities in a game. It's just not in his cards. So I'm ultimately just saying I wouldn't play Jerome Ford. But obviously, like I said, like, there's going to be guys who are below him. So in a week where we have a bunch of bye weeks, Jerome Ford is going to be ultimately moved up the list more so than I'm comfortable with doing on a regular basis. Dropping out to our next tier, Trey Sermon at 24 and Najee Harris at 25. Trey Sermon at the Jacksonville Jaguars. Some of you may be wondering who this is. This is Jonathan Taylor's backup in Indianapolis. And Jonathan Taylor suffered a high ankle sprain, so in all likelihood, he is not going to be playing in this game. Trey Sermon is the direct backup for Jonathan Taylor. So, based on whatever this team does at quarterback, it's gonna fluctuate what he can do. Because honestly, I think if Anthony Richardson plays, this team won't have much of a run game at all. Because they're gonna be one-dimensional. Because Richardson can't throw. But if it's Joe Flacco and they have the threat of the pass, I think that actually opens up holes for Trey Sermon. I think Trey Sermon could be a pretty decent play if Joe Flacco plays. I'm not projecting that that's going to be the story here. So the only reason he gets to at 24 with Anthony Richardson, my projected starter this week, is because he probably monopolizes the backfield this week. And then Najee Harris at 25 versus the Dallas Cowboys. Look, the matchup I actually think is okay. What we saw from Najee last week, who I projected to be a pretty good play last week, it was such a disaster, and it doesn't look like either of the running backs, Cordarrelle Patterson or Jaylen Warren, are going to be ready for this game. The problem with Najee is that he's so inefficient and so not explosive. If you take away targets and red zone carries from him, he's almost irrelevant. he's actually gotten both taken away. Both of them. Targets are not there, and the red zone carries, they're actually going to Justin Fields. So with Najee, this is just a very sad fantasy story here. I don't see much upside for Najee at this point. Devin Singletary at 26 at the Seattle Seahawks this week. I think Devin Singletary is what he is, right? Like I've been saying it for a while, and obviously last week I said Singletary was a good start too. I feel stupid on this one because I know, like, I've never been big on Singletary as is. Singletary is what he is. He's not an elite player. And when you put him on this offense with the New York Giants, just expect low minimal production. And against the Seahawks this week, if the Seahawks are again without their entire starting defensive line, he may get bumped up, but I'm expecting some of those players to be back this week. And with Singletary, if they don't have Malik Neighbors, they can't do anything offensively. So I just don't see a big ceiling for Singletary. And then to round out the tier, Rachaad White at 27 and Braylon Allen at 28 here. Now, with Rachaad White, I look at this guy and I say, this is a sinking ship. It's a sinking ship. Now, you can play him again because, like I said, I don't think he's going to be just riding the pine all game on Thursday night. I don't think that's what we're going to see. He still is an effective pass catcher. So if you go out there and let's say that Bucky Irving takes 15 carries and Rachaad White only has like 3 or 4. But what if Rachaad White is in on third downs and he gets like 5 or 6 targets? That's going to make him a valuable player in fantasy, especially on a week with this bunch of bye weeks. So Rachaad White is not out of the top 30 just yet, but he's definitely trending that way. And then Braylon Allen at 28. I'm putting him in here, again, because of bye weeks here. And at this point, I still believe in Breece Hall, but at this point, the Jets have seen enough with Braylon Allen to where it's like, how could you possibly justify putting this guy back on the bench? You can't. You cannot justify that. He has been so good on every touch. You have to give him more. So Braylon Allen, I just think, gets more opportunities because he's been that good with the Jets here. So I think that in a week where he's taking on a tough defense, they may be trying to find a spark anywhere. And Braylon Allen, he has been that guy in a lot of weeks. Could be that guy again. And then dropping down to our last tier here, rounding it out, DeAndre Swift and Rico Dowdle here. These are my two guys I just have no confidence in. Yeah, I get it. DeAndre Swift had a big game in week 4. It's going to take a lot more than just 1 week to counteract what we've seen from DeAndre Swift. I mean, he has been inept up to this point. Versus the Panthers, the matchup's not bad. I just don't trust DeAndre Swift ultimately. So if you do take that shot on your own, I'm not going to endorse it. And Rico Dowdle here gets in the end zone last week, but unless he gets in the end zone or starts to see more targets, his upside ultimately is just not that high. And then as I do at the end of every single rankings video, I give you my favorite underdog running back pick of the week, specifically designed for people who are getting in weekly best ball drafts on Underdog. Now, obviously, at the running back position, it's already more slim pickings than wide receivers, especially when you have bye weeks and injuries taken into account. So I'm going with Zach Charbonnet this week. The matchup versus the Giants is good. I think if we go based on last week when Kenneth Walker returned, he actually was still involved as a receiver. He had a drive or two where he was the running back on the field. So if that happens again, I'll take the upside in the matchup against the New York Giants for Zach Charbonnet. So let me know how your team is looking this week so far. And if you want to see the top 12 defense rankings for this week, click on this video right here.